The dish was already there waiting for her. Florence Crawford stood in the doorway of the Hadley farmhouse, her traveling trunk still balanced on the edge of the wagon behind her, and she could not move. Not because of the dust still swirling from the long road that had brought her out from Abilene, not because of the dry Kansas heat pressing down on the late September afternoon like a hand against her chest, and not because of the vast, golden fields of unharvested wheat stretching away on every side of her like a sea that had forgotten how to be anything but still and waiting. She could not move because of what she was looking at inside that open doorway. 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 sets of silverware laid out with a precision that no accident could explain, arranged on a table that had been scrubbed so clean she could nearly see her own reflection in the grain of the wood, wildflowers in a jar at the center, a folded cloth beside each setting. Someone had known she was coming. More than that, someone had prepared for her arrival with a care and deliberateness that made her breath catch somewhere beneath her ribs. She had written only one letter to Dexter Hadley. 1. In that letter she had said she would arrive before the end of harvest, that she could cook and clean and manage a household, that she had references from 2 families in Missouri, and that she expected nothing more than honest work and honest wages and a roof over her head until the season was done. There had been no warmth in that letter. She had not offered warmth. She had been running from something when she wrote it, and warmth was not a luxury she could afford to extend to strangers. But those plates. Florence stepped over the threshold, and the boards of the farmhouse floor exhaled softly beneath her boots, as though the house itself had been holding its breath. She reached out and touched the rim of one of the cups, ceramic, white with a thin blue line running around the lip, clean, warm from sitting in the afternoon light coming through the window. "Miss Crawford." The voice came from behind her, and it was not what she expected. She had expected someone older. She had built a picture in her mind on the long wagon ride out from town, a widower creased and bent by too many harvests and too much grief, someone who would look at her with tired eyes and hand her a list of chores and disappear back into the fields without ceremony. She had expected a man she could keep at arm's length without effort. She turned. Dexter Hadley was standing just inside the doorway she had walked through, holding his hat in both hands and watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. He was not old. He was perhaps 33 or 34, broad across the shoulders in the way that men who work land go broad, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead and eyes that were a shade of deep brown she associated with river water in late autumn. There was something careful about the way he was standing, deliberate. Like a man who had decided before he walked through that door exactly how he would hold himself and exactly what he would say, and was now discovering that neither of those preparations was working. "My children," he said, and then he stopped and started again. "They set your place before I could stop them. I hope you do not find it forward." They were eager. Florence looked back at the table. 3 plates. She counted again. 1 for her, she presumed, and then 2 others. 2 children. "How old?" she asked. "Eli is 9, Dexter said. "Me is 7. Florence nodded. She pulled her gaze away from the table and made herself look at him directly. She had been looking sideways at things for too long, she knew that, treating every new situation as something that might explode if she met it head-on. She was 30 years old and she was tired of the sideways approach. "Tell them thank you," she said. It was a kind thing to do. Something moved in his expression then, something brief and unguarded, and she filed it away without examining it too closely because she was not here for that. She was here to work through harvest. She was here because she needed to be somewhere. That was not the place she had left. She was here because a woman with a dark past and an emptied bank account and 1 good reference letter, and 1 letter she had burned before she could second-guess herself, needed to be somewhere, and this had been somewhere. That was all. That was what she told herself in those first hours, as Dexter Hadley showed her the house with a reserve that matched her own, as she met his 2 children who stood side by side at the base of the staircase and stared up at her with matching expressions of cautious hope, as she cooked supper from what she found in the larder and set it on the table beside those 3 carefully placed settings. That was what she told herself. She would discover, over the long weeks that followed, that it was not going to be quite so simple. Florence had come to Kansas from the town of Gallatin, Missouri, in the August of 1882, and the story of how she had gotten from Gallatin to that farmhouse doorway was a story she had no intention of telling anyone, not in full. Not the part about her former employer, a man named Harmon Vass, who had first hired her as a housekeeper and then spent the better part of 2 years attempting to convince her, through means that varied from flattery to financial coercion to outright threat, that she owed him something she was not prepared to give. Not the part about the night she had finally understood that staying was no longer an option. Not the part about what she had taken from his desk before she left, the single piece of paper that could ruin him if she chose to use it, the piece of paper she carried folded small inside the lining of her traveling trunk, because some part of her, the part that had learned the hard way that a woman alone needed leverage, had refused to go without it. She had come to Kansas because the advertisement in the newspaper had been plain and practical and free of any implication that she was expected to be anything other than capable. A widower, it had read, with 2 young children, seeks an experienced woman to board and cook and manage the household through the harvest season. Fair wages, clean room, references required. Inquire to D. Hadley, Ellsworth County, Kansas. She had read it 3 times. Then she had written the letter. Then she had burned Harmon Vass's secret before she could use it as protection and convinced herself she did not need protection anymore, that she was starting clean. That had been a lie, and she had known it was a lie even as she told it to herself, but it had been a necessary lie. The kind that gets a person moving when moving is the only alternative to standing still and being buried alive. The Hadley farm sat about 7 miles east of the town of Ellsworth, on land that had been worked by Dexter's father before him and his grandfather before that. 320 acres of Kansas wheat country, flat and wide, and relentless in its demands. The harvest was already 2 weeks behind when Florence arrived, delayed by an early September rain that had flattened part of the crop and required Dexter to renegotiate with the 2 hired hands he paid to help bring it in. She learned this not from Dexter directly, but from his daughter Mee, who had a gift for narrating the affairs of the farm with the confident authority of someone 3 times her age. Mee had dark hair like her father and enormous brown eyes that seemed to take in more than they let on, and from the very first morning she attached herself to Florence's side with a loyalty that was both touching and, at times, slightly overwhelming. Papa was very worried about the rain, Mee told Florence on her second morning, sitting at the kitchen table and watching her roll out biscuit dough with the attentive focus of a student determined not to miss a single lesson. He said words I am not supposed to repeat, but I heard them anyway. I suspect most people say words they should not when their livelihood is at stake, Florence said. She pressed the biscuit cutter down and lifted it and pressed it again. Do you know bad words, Miss Crawford? A few. Mee considered this with great seriousness. Papa does not like it when Eli says them, but Eli says them anyway when Papa cannot hear. Florence placed the biscuits in the pan and did not permit herself to smile. Where is your brother this morning? In the barn. He always goes to the barn when there is something unpleasant to do in the house. Papa says he has a talent for disappearing at the wrong moment. That is a talent many people possess. It was true, and she knew it intimately, and the knowledge lived in her like a stone she had swallowed that had never quite made it down. The talent for disappearing at the wrong moment. Harmon Vass had possessed it perfectly. 3 days before she left Gallatin, when she had finally brought herself to tell her friend Clara what had been happening, Clara had asked why she had not said something sooner, had not gone to someone, had not sought help, and Florence had found herself unable to answer because the honest answer was that she had spent 2 years waiting for someone to notice without her having to say it, and nobody had noticed. Nobody had been paying close enough attention. The people who should have seen it had been very skilled at looking in a different direction. She did not want to spend the rest of her life waiting for someone to look in the right direction. She put the biscuits in the oven, wiped her hands, and went to find out what needed to be done next. What needed to be done next, she discovered, was considerable. The Hadley house had been maintained in the practical way that a man alone with 2 children and a farm to run maintains a house, which is to say that it was not filthy, but it was not cared for. The curtains were clean but urine. The woodwork had not been polished in a long time. The pantry was organized in a way that suggested it had been reorganized several times by someone who was not certain of the right system, and had tried multiple approaches without settling on one. The garden behind the house, which had clearly once been something a woman had tended with pride, had gone to seed in the way that gardens go when they have been kept alive by obligation rather than love. She did not try to fix everything at once. She had learned, through bitter experience, the danger of arriving somewhere with too much energy and too much apparent competence, because people who arrived like that were treated as resources rather than people. They were leaned on until they broke, and then they were surprised by their own breaking. Florence had made that mistake once. She did not intend to make it again. Instead, she made a list in her own head, and she worked through it item by item, one thing each day, steady and unhurried, like a person who intended to still be standing at the end. She met the hired hands on her 3rd day. Their names were Frank Dobbs and a younger man everyone called Cotton, whose actual name she did not learn for a week. They were civil to her in the way that men are civil to a woman they are uncertain about, which is to say they were careful and slightly formal, and watched her out of the corners of their eyes to see what kind of person she was going to turn out to be. She gave them no reason to be concerned and no particular reason to be interested, and she went about her business, and after a while they stopped watching and started simply accepting her presence as a fact of the place. Dexter Hadley was harder to read. He was not a difficult man. She could see that easily enough. He was fair with the hands and patient with his children, and he did not leave messes for her to clean up that he could clean himself. He was up before dawn every morning, and she could hear him moving through the house before she came downstairs, hear the creak of his boots on the kitchen floorboards, the sound of the back door opening, and then the long quiet of a man already out in the fields before the sun had properly risen. He came in for meals and he ate with his children, and he asked her polite questions about whether she had everything she needed. And when she said yes, he nodded and thanked her for the meal and went back to what needed doing. She noticed things about him the way she noticed things about most situations, quietly and without making a production of it. She noticed that he always checked on his children before he came to the table, a quick hand on a shoulder or a brief word, nothing showy, just consistent presence. She noticed that when me talked at supper, which was often and at length, he listened without interrupting, even when the subject matter was extraordinarily mundane. She noticed that he kept a book on the small table beside his chair in the front room, a different one each week, and that the books were not practical farming manuals but novels and histories, Dickens and a biography of Abraham Lincoln, and once, to her considerable surprise, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman. She noticed that he did not ask her questions beyond what was polite. He did not press her for her history or her reasons. He seemed to understand, without it being stated, that she had not come to Kansas for the purpose of explaining herself. She respected that. She respected it so thoroughly that it made her slightly uncomfortable, because she was not accustomed to being given space to breathe without someone trying to fill the space with their own demands. 3 weeks into her time at the farm, something happened that shifted the careful equilibrium she had been maintaining. She was in the garden in the early morning, before the children were up, pulling up the dead growth that had choked out the late summer vegetables and turning the soil for what might be coaxed into a fall planting if the weather held. It was the kind of work she found satisfying in a wordless way, work that had a clear beginning and a clear end and a visible result, work that did not require her to negotiate or protect herself or calculate the angle of anyone's intentions. She heard the back door and looked up. Dexter was standing on the step with 2 cups of coffee. He held one out to her. She was so surprised that she took it without thinking, and then they were both standing there in the early morning light with cups of coffee, and neither of them had prepared for this situation. "You do not have to do the garden," he said. "That was not part of the arrangement." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at the bed she had cleared, which was already considerably more ordered than it had been. "My wife planted that garden," he said. "She had plans for it. Roses along that south wall, she always said. Never got to it." Florence looked at the south wall. She could see it, actually. The way the sunlight hit it in the morning. Yes, roses along that wall would have been exactly right. "How long has she been gone?" Florence asked, and immediately wondered if she had overstepped. 3 years this November," Dexter said. He held his coffee cup in both hands the way he held his hat in both hands, as though he needed something to anchor him. "Fever. It came on fast. I am sorry." "She would have liked you," he said, and then he seemed to catch himself, as though the words had arrived ahead of his intention to speak them, and he cleared his throat and looked out at the fields. "She liked people who got things done without making a fuss about it." Florence did not know what to do with that, so she took a drink of her coffee and looked at the garden and tried not to let her face show anything particular. "The children like having you here," he said. "I like them," she said, and that was entirely true, simpler and more honest than most things she had said in a long time. He nodded. Then he went back inside, and Florence stood in the garden for another moment with the coffee warming her hands, and she thought, very carefully and very deliberately, about the importance of keeping things exactly as they were. Professional. Correct. A woman doing a job she had contracted to do, living under a roof she was paying for in labor, and nothing more complicated than that. It was about this time that the letter arrived. She knew before she opened it. She knew from the handwriting on the outside of the envelope, the way the letters leaned forward, aggressive and certain, the way the H was written with a kind of exaggerated flourish that she associated with a man who thought his own signature was worth performing. Harmon Vass had found her. She sat with the envelope in her lap on the edge of her bed and did not open it for a long time. The room she had been given was small and plain, a white-painted iron bedstead and a dresser with a small mirror and a window that looked east over the fields, and she had made it her own in small ways. A bit of ribbon on the dresser, a book she had brought, her good shawl on the hook behind the door. It had begun to feel like somewhere she lived rather than somewhere she was passing through. She had not expected that. She had not meant for that to happen. She opened the letter. He had written with the precision of a man who had practiced what he wanted to say and pared it down to the essentials of coercion. He knew where she was. He had clearly either followed her route through Gallatin's stagecoach records or spoken to someone who knew where she was headed, and either possibility was equally alarming. He said, in the smooth and careful language of a man who had long experience making threats sound like offers, that there were things about Florence Crawford that a respectable household employer might find very interesting to know. That he had recently spoken with an acquaintance in Ellsworth. That he expected her to understand what that meant. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the lining of her traveling trunk beside the other document she kept there. And she sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the weight of what she was carrying. Then she stood up and went downstairs and started supper, because the children were going to be hungry in an hour and the world did not pause for the difficulties of a woman's dark past. But she could not fully push it down that evening. She was quieter than usual at supper, and me, who was observant in the way only 7-year-olds permitted themselves to be, studied her with open concern. "Are you sad, Miss Crawford?" me asked. "I am a little tired," Florence said. It was not entirely a lie. "Papa gets sad sometimes," me offered. "He goes out to the barn when he is sad. Eli goes to the barn when he wants to avoid chores, but Papa goes to the barn when he is sad. They go to the barn for different reasons." "I had noticed," Florence said. From across the table she felt Dexter's attention shift to her, brief and careful, the kind of attention a person pays when they suspect something is wrong and are trying to decide if they are allowed to ask. She did not look up. She ate her supper and answered Me's questions and made sure Eli finished his vegetables before excusing himself. And after the children were in bed, she washed the dishes and went to her room and lay awake listening to the night sounds of the farm until eventually sleep took her. The next morning she was up before dawn as she always was, and when she came downstairs Dexter was already at the kitchen table with his coffee. He looked up when she came in, and before she could move to the stove he said, quietly, "Florence." It was the first time he had used her given name. She stopped. "If something is wrong," he said, "and if I can help, I would like you to tell me." She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him. He was watching her with that careful expression she had catalogued over the past weeks, the one that was not quite neutral and not quite personal, somewhere in between, in that space where someone is trying to give you room to decide for yourself. "There is a man in Missouri," she said, and then she stopped. She had not intended to say that much. He waited. "He was my employer," she said. "He is not a good man. He found out where I am." Dexter set his coffee cup down. "Did he threaten you? In a manner of speaking." "What manner?" She looked at him for a long moment. "He implied that he could speak to people here in a way that would harm my reputation, my character." Dexter was quiet. In the dimness before full dawn, with just the lamp on the table between them, his face was composed and still. "Did he have cause to do that honestly?" he said, and his voice was not accusatory, just measured, asking something that needed to be asked. "No," she said, "he had cause to do it dishonestly, which is worse because there is no rebuttal to a well-placed lie." He nodded slowly. "I am sorry he is following you. I am sorry I brought it to your door." "You did not bring it," he said. "He brought it. There is a difference." He picked up his coffee again. "You do not need to be afraid here. Whatever he says to anyone in Ellsworth, I will say differently." Florence stood in the kitchen doorway and felt something shift in her chest, something small and hard and long-locked. It was not gratitude exactly, though she was grateful. It was more like recognition. Like recognizing something she had been looking for without realizing she was looking for it. She said, "Thank you," and went to start breakfast, and neither of them mentioned it again that morning. But things were different after that. Not in any dramatic or demonstrable way, nothing that could be pointed to and named, but different in the way that a room is different once a window has been opened in it. The air moved differently. She moved more freely in it. October came in on a dry, bright wind that turned the remaining wheat a deep gold and made the already urgent harvest more urgent still. Dexter and the hands were out from before first light until after dark, and Florence ran the house, managed the meals, kept the children in some semblance of school routine, and found herself wishing, for the first time in a long time, that the days were longer rather than shorter. Eli, who had been cautious with her in the way of a 9-year-old boy who has been disappointed before and is not prepared to be disappointed again, had begun to thaw. He was a serious child, not unhappy but careful, and Florence discovered that what he responded to was not warmth exactly but respect. He did not want to be coddled. He wanted to be treated as someone whose opinions and observations were worth taking seriously. Once she understood that, the distance between them collapsed relatively quickly. He began to bring her things he had found in the fields. Interesting rocks, unusual feathers, once the shed skin of a snake that he placed on the kitchen table, with the grave presentation of someone delivering important findings to a colleague. She received each offering with the seriousness they warranted, and Eli's cautious eyes began to lose some of their caution. "Did your papa ever tell you the history of this land?" she asked him one afternoon while he was doing his sums at the kitchen table. Eli looked up. "He said his grandfather homesteaded it, that it was Osage land before." "That is true," Florence said. She was folding laundry and she paused with a shirt between her hands. "This whole country was Osage territory. Your family came after the government took it from them." Eli was quiet for a moment in the way he went quiet when something required real processing. "Is that wrong?" he said. "It is a complicated wrong," Florence said. "One that cannot be undone, only understood. But understanding it matters." Eli chewed the end of his pencil. "Papa says we owe the land our best effort because it was given at someone else's expense." Florence felt something warm move through her. "Your father said that. He says it sometimes when we want to skip chores." She laughed. It was a real laugh, not the controlled, polite kind she had been producing for months, and it surprised her. Eli looked at her as though he had not expected it either, and then a small grin crossed his usually solemn face, quick as a rabbit, and then they were both smiling at each other over his arithmetic. That evening, when Dexter came in from the fields and found his son actually completing his arithmetic, and his hired boarder setting the table with an expression that looked, for the first time, genuinely at ease, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before anyone noticed him. When Florence looked up and caught him there, she did not know exactly what his expression meant, only that it was something, and that she felt the something of it all the way from where she was standing. Later that night, after the children were in bed, they sat in the front room for the first time, him in his chair with his Lincoln biography, and her with the mending she had taken on without being asked. The lamp threw a warm circle of light around the two of them, and outside the wind pushed across the flat dark fields, and it was very quiet and very ordinary, and Florence was aware, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, that she was content, that this was what content felt like. She had been away from it long enough that the sensation was slightly foreign, like hearing music again after a long silence. She was so absorbed in the recognition of it that she almost did not hear him speak. "Tell me about Missouri," he said. He was still looking at his book, so it did not feel like a demand. It felt like an invitation she could accept or decline. She considered it. "I grew up in St. Joseph," she said. "My father was a printer. My mother died when I was 12. I kept house for my father after that, and then when he died I kept house for other people. That is most of the story." "And the man," he said, "the one from Gallatin." She put the mending down in her lap. "I worked for him for 2 years. He was a landowner, well regarded in town. He decided at some point that my position in his household gave him certain claims over me that I had never agreed to." She said it plainly, without drama, the way you say something true when you are done letting it hold power over you through silence. "I left when I understood that staying would cost me things I was not prepared to lose." Dexter had set his book down. He was looking at her now. "He hurt you." "He tried," she said. "He did not fully succeed, but not for lack of effort." The muscle in his jaw moved. "I am glad you left." "So am I," she said, "though it took me longer than it should have." "Those things always do," he said, and there was something in his voice that told her he was not speaking only theoretically, that he had his own experience with the tyranny of obligation and the weight of staying in a situation past the point of wisdom. She filed that away carefully, not pressing, only noting. "He wrote to me last week," she said. "The letter you noticed I had received. I thought it might be something like that. He implied he has a contact in Ellsworth. Someone who can be made to say unkind things about me." Dexter's expression shifted slightly. "Do you know who?" "Not yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know most of the people in and around Ellsworth well enough to know who is susceptible to that kind of persuasion and who is not. If you will let me, I would like to ask some quiet questions." Florence looked at him. The lamp caught the angles of his face, and she thought again, as she had many times by now, that he was not what she had expected. Not in any single particular. Not in his patience or his reading or the way he listened to his daughter or the way he spoke about his land or the way he was looking at her right now, with a focused, quiet directness that was not threatening but was also not nothing. "All right," she said. "Ask your quiet questions." He nodded. Then he picked his book up again, and she picked her mending up again, and the wind moved in the dark outside, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. It was the most comfortable silence Florence Crawford had experienced in approximately 8 years. She was, she realized as she went up the stairs to bed, in considerable trouble. Not the kind of trouble she was used to. Not the kind with a dark past pressing at her heels, or a man using power as a weapon, or the familiar desperate arithmetic of a woman calculating what she could afford to lose. This was a different kind of trouble. The kind where something you decided you were not going to feel has already arrived and taken up residence without waiting for your permission. She lay awake in her room with the east window showing her the first blue edge of stars, and thought very seriously about the practical considerations of leaving when harvest ended. She had saved most of her wages. She had the folded letter in her trunk, and the decision about what to do with it still unmade. She could go south, maybe Texas, or east again, back toward civilization and city work, or west toward Colorado where there was reportedly work for capable women with good references. She had options. She had always had options, even when it had not felt like it. She went to sleep telling herself that the options remained open and that she was going to be very sensible about all of this. Then Harmon Vass arrived in Ellsworth. She did not know he was there until the morning Dexter came in from town with a face that was carrying something carefully controlled. He had gone to town for supplies, a trip he made every 2 weeks, and he came back 2 hours later than expected with the wagon and a silence around him that she recognized as the silence of a man who has learned something he does not want to have learned. "He is at the Drover's Hotel," Dexter said, in the kitchen while the children were in the yard. "He arrived day before yesterday. He has been talking to people." Florence set down the bread she had been slicing. "What has he been saying?" "Various things, most of them untrue." Dexter looked at her directly. "He told Clarence Aldridge at the general store that you are a woman who left your last position under suspicious circumstances and that any respectable household ought to be warned." Florence heard the bread knife click against the cutting board. Her hand had tightened on it without her permission. "I see. Aldridge did not seem to take it as gospel," Dexter said. "He knows me well enough to know I choose my people carefully, but Vass has also apparently spoken to Judge Elwood, and Elwood is the kind of man who repeats things." "What does he want?" Florence asked, though she already knew. "He asked Aldridge where the Hadley farm was," Dexter said. "He knows what he wants. He wants you to know there is no distance far enough." Florence stood very still for a moment. Then she went to the staircase and up to her room and opened her traveling trunk and took out the envelope from its place in the lining and stood looking at it. The document inside it was a record of a financial transaction that Harmon Vass had made in the spring of 1881. She had come across it accidentally while organizing his papers, and she had understood immediately what it represented. A payment made to a county commissioner in exchange for a water rights ruling that had benefited Vass and destroyed 3 smaller farms whose owners had then been forced to sell to him at ruined prices. It was fraud. It was corruption. It was the kind of thing that, in the right hands, could end a man's standing in the community and very possibly result in criminal proceedings. She had taken it because she had known, even then, that she might eventually need it. She had burned it in her imagination multiple times in the months since leaving, trying to convince herself that she was above using it, that she was not going to be the kind of person who survived by holding weapons over other people's heads. That was what Vass did. She was not Vass, but Vass was in Ellsworth. She went back downstairs with the envelope. Dexter was still in the kitchen. He looked at what was in her hand. "He made a corrupt payment to a county official in 1881, she said. "I have the record of it. I kept it because I thought I might need protection. I did not want to use it, but he is here and he is going to make sure I lose this position and everything I have managed to build here, and I need you to know what it is I am carrying." Dexter looked at the envelope for a long moment. He did not reach for it. He looked at her instead. "You have been carrying that alone since Missouri." "Yes. You could have told me sooner. I barely knew you." "You know me now," he said simply. She felt those 3 words in a way that was entirely disproportionate to their length. She looked at him, and he was just standing there in the kitchen of his farm with the sun coming through the window and the sound of his children in the yard outside. And she thought that in all the years she had been managing on her own, she had not once been spoken to quite like that. With the casual certainty of someone who had simply decided you were known to them and was not asking permission for the decision. She put the envelope on the table. "What do I do with it?" she asked. "Is there a telegraph office in Ellsworth?" "Yes." "Is there a county seat or a newspaper that would have jurisdiction over the official he bribed?" "The commissioner was in Davis County, Missouri," she said. "Gallatin." "Then you write a letter," he said, "to the Gallatin newspaper and to the county clerk's office and to the Missouri state attorney. You send copies of this document with each letter. You do it today before he has a chance to do whatever he is planning to do." Florence stared at him. "He will retaliate." "He will try," Dexter said. "But a man who has just been reported to 3 separate authorities for corruption does not have as much time to spend retaliating as he thinks." She picked up the envelope. She looked at him. "Why are you helping me?" He looked at her with those river-water eyes, steady and sure. "Because you deserve to have someone in your corner," he said. "And because I would like to be that person if you will permit it." That was the moment. Florence Crawford would know it in hindsight as the exact moment she stopped fighting what was already happening inside her. She did not say anything dramatic. She did not need to. She simply held his gaze for a count of 3, and then she said, "All right," and the 2 words carried more weight than any paragraph she could have constructed. They went to Ellsworth that afternoon, both of them, leaving the children with Cotton's wife, who lived on the adjacent property and was a dependable woman who had been kind to Florence since the first week. They went to the telegraph office and then to the postal station, and Florence sent her letters, all 3 of them, with the copied document enclosed in each. It felt like setting something on fire. It felt like a burning off of everything she had been dragging behind her. They were on their way back to the wagon when Harmon Vass walked out of the Drovers Hotel across the street. He saw her. She saw him see her. He was a heavy-set man of about 55, well-dressed in the way of men who have more money than taste, with a red face and cold, pale eyes that she associated with the particular kind of danger that comes packaged in respectability. He stopped on the boardwalk and looked at her, and then his eyes moved to Dexter beside her and something shifted in his expression. Florence did not cross the street. She stood where she was, and she was aware of Dexter standing at her left, very close, close enough that she could feel the solid fact of him, and she looked at Harmon Vass across the dusty main street of Ellsworth, Kansas, and she did not look away. Vass stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked again at Dexter. Whatever he read in that situation, it clearly complicated his calculation. He looked back at Florence once more, and she met his look with everything she had, the long 2 years of accumulated refusal and the letters she had just sent, and the person standing beside her who had said plainly that he wanted to be in her corner, all of it gathered up into a look that said she was done running. Vass turned and went back inside the hotel. Florence let out a slow breath. The tension in her shoulders released in layers, like ice thawing from the outside in. "Are you all right?" Dexter asked. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. He offered her his arm for the walk back to the wagon, the kind of offer made casually that is not actually casual at all. And after a brief hesitation she took it, and they walked back through the main street of Ellsworth with the autumn sun on the storefronts and the smell of horses and dust, and somewhere distant the sound of a fiddle from one of the saloons. And Florence thought that she was not entirely certain what she was walking toward, but that, for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid of it. Harmon Vass left Ellsworth 3 days later. Florence only knew this because the hotel keeper, a man named Briggs who was acquainted with Dexter and had apparently decided to keep an eye on things, sent word out to the farm. Florence received the news while she was hanging laundry in the side yard and felt the leaving of something she had been carrying for 2 years, felt it go out of her like a breath she had been holding since Gallatin, and she had to sit down on the porch step and put her face in her hands for a moment that was not sadness but was something adjacent to it, the strange grief of a long fear finally ending. Me found her there. Miss Crawford, me said, sitting down beside her with the natural unself-consciousness of a child. Are you crying? A little, Florence admitted, but it is a good kind of crying. Me considered this with her characteristic gravity. Mama used to cry at sunset sometimes, she said. She said they were too beautiful not to. Florence lowered her hands and looked at this small girl beside her, with her dark hair and her big eyes and her perfect, undefended heart, and felt the love she had been quietly accumulating for the past 2 months arrive all at once in full force. Your mama sounds like she was a wonderful person, Florence said. She was, me said. I miss her all the time. But it is better now than it was. She paused. Papa is better too since you came. Florence looked at the fields. The harvest was almost in. The last of the wheat stood in rows waiting for the final cutting, golden in the October light, and the sky above was the particular blue that only Kansas does in autumn, wide and deep and absolutely without apology. I am glad, she said softly. I am very glad. She went back inside when she had steadied herself, and she went about the afternoon's work. And at supper that evening she was more herself than she had been perhaps since she arrived. Lighter in some way she could not precisely articulate, as though the weight she had been carrying had not just lifted but had been recognized and set down with ceremony. Dexter noticed. She saw him notice. Over the meal he was perhaps a fraction less measured than usual, his attention a degree more open, a degree less carefully neutral. When the children were arguing about something and Florence made a remark that resolved the argument with what she considered reasonable logic, he smiled at her across the table, a real smile, unguarded and warm, and it was the single most compelling thing she had seen in recent memory. That night again, they sat in the front room. She had given up pretending that she did not enjoy this. She sat with her mending and he sat with his book, and the lamp made its circle, and outside the October wind moved through the harvested fields with a sound like distance, like everything open and possible. After a while he said, "The last of the wheat comes in this week." "Yes," she said. She kept her eyes on her mending. "That was the end of the arrangement," he said, "as it was agreed." "Yes," she said again. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that you may refuse without it changing anything between us in terms of how I regard you. I want that to be clear." She looked up. He had set his book down and he was looking at her with an expression that was not guarded at all, that was entirely open and a little bit uncertain and entirely real. "I want to ask you to stay," he said, "not as a boarder, not in an arrangement. I want to ask you to stay because these past weeks have been the most alive I have felt since Alina died, and my children are happier than they have been in 3 years, and I think, though I am aware I might be wrong, that you are not entirely miserable here either." Florence put the mending down. "I want to court you properly," he said. "If you will let me, I want to take my time and do this right and give you every opportunity to decide freely. I am not asking you to decide anything tonight. I am asking you to stay so that there is the possibility of deciding." Florence looked at him for a long moment. There was a part of her, the part that had been shaped by 2 years of Harmon Vass and 10 years before that of managing entirely alone and 12 years before that of learning that people left or took or disappeared. That part wanted to offer a practical response, wanted to talk about wages and terms and the propriety of the arrangement. Instead she said, "I do not want a slow courtship." He blinked. "I do not mean to be indelicate," she said, and to her own considerable surprise she felt a warmth climbing up her neck. "I only mean that I am 30 years old and I have spent a great deal of my life being very careful and very slow and very measured, and I am tired of it. I know what I feel. I have known it for several weeks. I was simply waiting to be sure that it was not simply the gratitude or the proximity or the relief of feeling safe somewhere after a long time of not feeling safe." "And are you sure now?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "I am sure," she said. "It is not gratitude. It is not proximity. I have been near plenty of people and not felt any of this for any of them." He stood up. She stood up. They were standing in the lamplight with 3 feet of distance between them and the front room of the farmhouse around them, and the wind outside and the just-finished harvest waiting in its golden quiet. And he crossed the 3 feet and took her hands in his, both of them, and held them with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything. "Florence," he said, and her name in his voice was different from anything else, particular, like something being spoken for the first time in the right language. "Dexter," she said back, and it was different too, like opening a door she had been standing in front of for a long time without touching the handle. He kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was the kind of kiss that happens between two people who have been circling something true for a long time and have finally, carefully, with full deliberation and intention, arrived at it. His hands were still holding hers, and when she leaned into him, he let go of her hands to put his arms around her instead, and she let herself be held, which she had not done in so long that the simple fact of it made her close her eyes and breathe. They stood like that in the lamplight for a long while, which was, as Florence would later think, quite enough to be going on with. November came in cold and bright, with frost on the fields before dawn and the smell of wood smoke from morning until night, and the harvest was in and the land rested, and the Hadley farm turned to the slower, interior life of a farm in winter, tending animals and mending fences and splitting wood and taking stock. Florence stayed. Nobody was surprised, least of all Dexter, who had the good sense not to adopt an "I told you so" expression about it, and least of all the children, who received the news of her staying with the specific satisfaction of people who had been working toward this outcome for some time and knew it. Me told her this directly. "We put out 3 plates because we wanted you to know there was room," she said, in the frank way me said most things. "Eli said it would make you stay." Florence, who was in the kitchen making a pie at the time, stopped rolling the pastry. "Eli said that. He said if we showed you there was room you would not feel like you had to leave." Me tilted her head. Was he right? Florence thought about it. She thought about standing in the doorway of this farmhouse on a September afternoon with her trunk on the wagon and 3 plates already waiting for her on a scrubbed table with wildflowers in a jar. She thought about what it had meant to arrive somewhere and find that someone had already made space for you before you even walked through the door. "Yes," she said. He was right. Me nodded with great satisfaction and went off to find her brother to report this intelligence, and Florence went back to the pie with a feeling in her chest she could only describe as full. The courtship, such as it was, given Florence's stated preference for not being overly slow about it, proceeded with a particular quality that she had not anticipated. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, something that felt more like a negotiation, 2 adults making practical arrangements dressed up in the language of romance. What she had not expected was the quality of ease it had. It was not effortless, nothing real ever is, but it had a rightness to it that made the effort feel like something she wanted rather than something she was managing. They talked in the evenings. Long, unhurried conversations that ranged across everything. His time growing up on this land and the father he had both admired and disagreed with, her childhood in St. Joseph, and the father who had given her a love of books, and the mother she had lost too young, and the particular loneliness of managing a household at 12 years old when you were still just a girl. Eleanor, his wife, whom he spoke of with the honest grief of a man who had loved truly and lost truly, and had not pretended either away. The children and what they needed and how to give it to them. The land and what it asked of the people who worked it. He told her once in December, standing in the kitchen doorway after supper watching her put the children to bed, that he had not thought he was capable of this, of wanting someone again, that after Eleanor he had assumed that part of him had simply closed and would stay closed, and that he had been making peace with that when her letter had arrived. Florence, who had come back downstairs and found him still standing in the doorway, said, "Why did you answer it? You must have received other inquiries." "I did," he said, 3 others. They were all quite suitable." He paused. Yours was the only one that sounded like someone who needed to be somewhere as much as she was capable of being useful. She raised her eyebrows. You could tell that from a single letter. I have been reading people for a long time, he said. My mother always said it was a gift and a burden. She was right. Florence stood in the kitchen light and shook her head slowly. I came here because I was running away from something, she said. I want you to know that. I came here because I needed to be somewhere else, and your advertisement was practical, and I was desperate, and I was not looking for anything more than a roof and honest work. I know, he said. And now, she said, and paused. Now, he agreed quietly. And now I would very much like to stay forever, she said, and the plainness of it surprised even her, the total absence of self-protection or calculation. Just the simple and complete truth of a person who had decided to stop managing her own heart at arm's length. Dexter crossed the kitchen and kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then, properly, her mouth. And she kissed him back with the full and unheld force of everything she had been not quite saying for months. Christmas on the Hadley farm in 1882 was the first Christmas in 3 years that felt, by everyone's later account, like the word was fully meant. Florence made a Christmas pudding from her mother's recipe, the one she had carried in her head since she was 12 and her mother had made it for the last time, and Dexter cut a cedar from the back pasture, and the children decorated it with paper chains and a few glass ornaments that had survived from Aline's collection, wrapped carefully in cloth in a box at the top of the wardrobe. Me handled each ornament with a solemnity that Florence found both heartbreaking and perfect, setting each one on a branch with the precision of someone doing something important. Eli gave Florence a rock he had found in the east field, smoothed flat by some ancient water and marked with a fossilized impression that might have been a fern or might have been something older than either of them could put a name to. He presented it with the same grave formality with which he presented all his field findings, and she put it on her windowsill where the morning light would hit it, and she intended to keep it indefinitely. Dexter gave her a book, a novel by George Eliot, Middlemark, that he had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita. Inside the cover he had written, in his steady, clear handwriting, for Florence, who came here to board and stayed to matter. The inscription was simple and entirely sufficient, and she read it 4 times before she closed the cover. And when she looked up at him across the room with the children tearing into their gifts, and the cedar smell and the fire and all of it, she thought that she was perhaps the most fortunate woman in Kansas, which was something she had not thought about herself in a very long time. January 1883 was cold in the way Kansas January is cold, which is to say relentlessly and with great open-field conviction, and the farm turned inward and quiet. Dexter worked the livestock and the maintenance and the endless small labors of keeping a working farm alive through winter. Florence taught the children their lessons and kept the house and cooked and read and found, in the long white afternoons, that the solitude she had once used as armor was no longer necessary in the same way. She could be quiet here without the quiet meaning anything dangerous. She could simply be still. She wrote to her friend Clara in Gallatin in January. A long letter, the first she had written to anyone in months. She told Clara where she was and what had happened with Vass and the letters she had sent to the authorities, and the fact that Vass had left Ellsworth and that she had received, in late November, a brief letter from the Davis County Attorney's office confirming receipt of her documentation and informing her that an inquiry had been opened. She told Clara about the farm and the children, and with some care in her word choice, about Dexter. Clara wrote back in February with a letter that was mostly exclamation marks and capitalized words conveying considerable enthusiasm, and a request for very much more information about the widower with the river water eyes, who was the way Florence had described him in the letter without entirely meaning to. Florence wrote back and confirmed that yes, she was happy, and yes, it was serious, and yes, she intended to stay, and could Clara please tell anyone in Gallatin who needed to know that Florence Crawford was doing very well and had nothing to be ashamed of, and was disinclined to be apologetic about any chapter of her history. Clara wrote back that she had already been saying exactly that, and that the inquiry into Vass had apparently already resulted in considerable difficulty for the man, and that 2 of the farmers whose land he had taken had retained a lawyer. Florence folded that letter and held it for a moment and thought about justice, about the slow grinding of it and the way it rarely arrived on time but sometimes arrived eventually, and she felt a satisfaction that was not triumph, nothing so sharp as that, but something quieter and more durable, a settling of accounts that allowed her to look forward without constantly looking back. In March, Dexter asked her to marry him. He did it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with the children conspicuously absent, having been dispatched to Cotton's wife's farm on an errand that Florence suspected had been constructed for exactly this purpose. He sat across the table from her with a small box in front of him, and his hat off and his hands flat on the table beside the box, and he asked her in direct plain language, without preamble or elaboration, whether she would consider being his wife. The box contained a ring that had been his grandmother's, a thin gold band with a small garnet that caught the morning light coming through the kitchen window and held it. Florence looked at the ring and then at him and said, "Yes, obviously yes. I should think that was clear by now." He laughed. It was a full laugh, unexpected and delighted, and she thought that she had heard him laugh before, but not quite like that, not with that particular quality of someone who has been surprised into joy. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he held it, and the morning light came through the window, and the garnet glowed, and outside the March wind was doing what it does on the flat Kansas plain, which is to move with absolute purpose and no apology. They were married in April, in the little Methodist church in Ellsworth, with Reverend Alcott presiding and half the county in attendance, because when you have been a working farmer in Ellsworth County for the better part of your adult life, your wedding is a community event whether you planned for it to be or not. Cotton and Frank Dobbs were there, and Aldridge from the general store, and Briggs from the hotel, and Cotton's wife, and various families from neighboring farms, and Reverend Alcott's wife who cried, apparently, at every wedding she attended, and made no exception for this one. Me wore her best dress and took the responsibility of flower girl with the gravity of someone performing a sacred duty, scattering petals in the aisle with perfect spacing and a focused expression that made several members of the congregation smile. Eli stood beside his father and passed the ring when the moment came, and then stood very straight and serious through the rest of the ceremony, and only when Florence glanced at him during the vows did she catch the briefest, most controlled flash of satisfaction on his small, serious face, the expression of a 9-year-old boy who had predicted this outcome and was experiencing the very private satisfaction of being correct. Florence wore a dress she had made herself over the winter, a deep blue wool that was practical enough for the spring weather and fine enough for the occasion, and she carried the wildflowers that Me had gathered from the first spring growth along the creek, yellow and white and small and perfect. She walked down the aisle of the little church without anyone to give her away, because she had given herself away to too many people over the years in ways she had not chosen, and she chose now to walk to Dexter Hadley on her own 2 feet of her own free will, and she thought that a leaner would have understood and approved of this. The vows were traditional. She meant every word. She watched his face while they were said, and he watched hers, and the room was very full and very quiet and very warm. And when Reverend Alcott pronounced them married and Dexter kissed her, and the church erupted in the kind of noise that small communities make when they have been rooting for something to happen, and it finally has, Florence Crawford, who was now Florence Hadley, thought that she had come to this farmhouse 7 months ago to run away from one life, and had instead run directly into a better one, which was perhaps the finest kind of accident a person could manage. The reception was held at the farm itself, tables set out in the yard with the spring sun on them, and food contributed by half a dozen neighboring families in the tradition of the place and the time. There was music, fiddle and guitar, and dancing on the flat ground by the barn. And the children danced together, and then separately, and then with Florence, and then with their father, and then with anyone who would have them. Eli danced with a solemnity that was ultimately undermined by the fact that he was clearly enjoying himself too much to maintain it. Me danced with the absolute conviction of someone who had been born knowing how. Later, when the sun was getting low and some of the guests had gone, and the remaining ones had settled into the comfortable loose end of a celebration that has peaked and is now gently declining, Dexter found Florence standing at the edge of the yard looking at the fields. The wheat had been planted again, late March, and the first green was just beginning to show, the faintest suggestion of color along the rows, the annual promise of what was coming. He stood beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood like that in the late light while behind them their community unwound itself and their children ran in the last of the day, and the farm breathed around them in the way that farms breathe in April, full and patient and certain. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Beyond the capacity of any word I currently know," she said, "which is saying something given how many I read." He pressed his mouth to her temple, and she closed her eyes, and the spring wind moved through the young wheat, and it was everything. Summer came, and the farm grew loud with the ordinary abundance of a household fully inhabited and loved. Florence had gradually, and without premeditation, become the center of the domestic life of the Hadley farm in a way that was entirely different from any position she had held before, not because she was employed there, but because she was claimed there, as wife and as stepmother and as neighbor, and as the woman who had brought the garden at the south wall back to life, and planted climbers against the stone that Dexter said were going to be roses by next spring if they survived the first winter. Which Florence said they would because she intended to defend them against the weather through force of will, if necessary. She and me worked the garden together in the long summer evenings, and me showed her where all the spring plants had come up, and taught her the names of the wildflowers, the way a child teaches an adult when the adult is willing to be taught, with enormous pleasure and a certain proprietorial pride. Florence learned the names and used them, and me was satisfied. Eli, who was now 10 and increasingly interested in the mechanics of how things worked, had become Dexter's shadow in the fields in a way that was clearly the beginning of a longer inheritance, not just of land, but of knowledge and approach, and the particular way a Hadley man walks land he loves. Florence watched the two of them sometimes from the kitchen window, the father and son moving across the fields with the same unhurried, purposeful stride, and it made something in her soft in a way she had not expected. She was carrying their child by August. She knew before she told anyone, knew in the body-certain way that allowed for no argument, and she held the knowledge alone for 2 weeks while she let it settle, while she made room for it inside herself, while she did the quiet recalculation of a woman who has decided what her life is and is now being invited to let it be more. She was not frightened, which surprised her. She was not entirely certain what she was. Expanded, perhaps. Like a room that had just discovered it had more walls than it thought. She told Dexter on an August evening in the garden while he was helping her stake the climbers along the south wall. She said it simply and directly, as she said most things by now, and he went very still for a moment, the way he went still when something was too large for his immediate response, and then he turned and looked at her, and his face was entirely open. No reserve, no careful management, just Dexter Hadley in full and clear expression of a man receiving news that reorganizes everything in the best possible way. He took her face in both his hands. He did not say anything for a moment. "Good," he finally said. "That is very, very good." She laughed and pressed her forehead to his, and they stood in the summer garden with the south wall behind them and the stars beginning over the flat Kansas sky. She told the children the next morning at breakfast, as directly as she had told him, because she believed children deserved directness, and they responded characteristically. Me received the news with enormous eyes and an immediate request for input on the name. Eli received the news with a long considering silence, and then he said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We do not know yet," Florence said. "I would prefer a brother," Eli said. "I will take that under advisement," Florence said gravely. Me said she would prefer a sister and that they should name her something beautiful, and offered 3 suggestions immediately, 2 of which were the names of flowers. The pregnancy was ordinary and uncomplicated, and other than a period of fierce morning sickness in September that Florence endured with the grim determination she brought to most obstacles, largely well managed. She was healthy and strong, and the farm's work kept her moving, which she preferred. Dexter hovered, occasionally, in the way of men who care too much and know too little about the specific requirements of the situation, and Florence appreciated the hovering and gently redirected it when necessary. She received, in October of that year, a letter from the Davis County Attorney's Office in Missouri, informing her that Harmon Vass had been formally charged with fraud and bribery in connection with the 1881 water rights case, that 2 of the affected farmers had successfully brought civil suits, and that her documentation had been instrumental in establishing the case. The letter was formal and dry and entirely adequate. Florence read it twice and then folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer of her bedside table, next to the inscription in her copy of Middlemark, and felt, quite thoroughly, free. She showed it to Dexter. He read it without comment and then looked at her and said, "Good," with the same simple weight he gave to that word when it mattered most. Then he went back to reading, and she went back to her book, and the lamp made its circle, and the October wind moved through the harvested fields, and everything was exactly as it should be. Their son was born in the first week of February 1884, in the farmhouse, with a midwife named Mrs. Pierce from Ellsworth, who had delivered most of the county's children for the past 20 years, and approached the profession with a matter-of-fact competence that Florence found deeply reassuring. The birth was hard in the ordinary way that births are hard, which is to say entirely and without apology, and Florence came through it with the same focus she brought to any difficult task, which was to keep going until it was done. The boy was large and healthy, and announced himself with considerable volume at the moment of arrival, which Mrs. Pierce said was an excellent sign, and which Dexter, who had been waiting downstairs in the way that fathers in 1884 waited, took as a positive indication of character. They named him James, after Dexter's father. James William Hadley, the William being for Florence's own father, whose name she had never given anyone before and had been saving without knowing she was saving it. Eli came into the room first, ahead of me, having apparently won whatever negotiation had taken place on the landing, and he looked at his new brother with an expression of concentrated assessment, and then said, "He is very red," which was accurate, and which Mrs. Pierce confirmed was entirely normal. Me came in immediately behind him and looked at the baby with an expression of such total adoration that it was briefly necessary for Florence to get herself back under control, because it was the most purely beautiful thing she had seen, and she was not quite steady enough for it yet. "Can I hold him?" Me asked. "When you have washed your hands," Florence said. Me departed to wash her hands with unusual speed and returned, and Florence watched her hold her new brother with the same careful gravity she gave to Aline's Christmas ornaments, and thought that this child was going to be loved so thoroughly by the family she had landed in that there was nothing left to worry about on his behalf. Dexter came in last, after the children, because he had been asked to give Mrs. Pierce time to finish her work, and when he came through the door and saw Florence in the bed with the lamp behind her and the baby in her arms and his 2 older children sitting on the edge of the bed, he stopped in the doorway in the same way he had stopped all those months ago on the first evening she arrived, with something in his expression that was beyond what any word she knew could quite reach. She looked at him from the bed. "Come here," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put James in his arms, and Dexter Hadley held his 3rd child and looked down at him with an expression of absolute, uncomplicated love, And then he looked up at Florence, and that was the same love in the same unguarded face. And she reached over and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face into her hand for a moment. And the lamp was warm, and the winter was outside, and the family was all in the room, and everything. Every thread that had ever been pulled loose was gathered and held. The years settled in after that with the good weight of a life being lived properly. Florence's roses bloomed against the south wall in the spring of 1885, the year James took his first steps across the kitchen floor with the single-minded determination of a person who has decided to be mobile and is not going to be talked out of it. They were red, the roses, deep and particular against the pale stone, and Florence stood looking at them on the morning they first opened and thought about the woman who had planted the garden before her, who had always said there should be roses along that wall and never got to them. She said a quiet thank you to a leaner Hadley, standing in the April garden, and meant it with complete sincerity, because the woman's children had set out 3 plates before a stranger arrived, and that stranger had been herself, and she was not certain she would have stayed otherwise, not certain the ground would have felt solid enough to stand on if she had walked in and found nothing prepared, nothing held out, nothing that said you are expected and there is room for you here. 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 sets of silverware on a scrubbed table. The 2 children who had done it were now 12 and 10, taller and more themselves with every season, and the family they had arranged to save without quite knowing they were doing it was the fullest thing Florence had ever been part of. Me had taken to helping with the younger children in the neighborhood when families needed it, with the authority of someone who has been looking after others her entire life, and considers it simply part of what a person does. She was going to be formidable, Florence thought, and told her so, and me received the assessment with the unblinking confidence of a girl who had always known it, and was glad to have it confirmed. Eli had begun to read seriously, the way Florence read, across everything, not just the farming manuals that were his practical inheritance, but the novels and histories, and the newspaper that came from Wichita every week. He and Florence had conversations about books now that sometimes went on through supper and into the evening, and Dexter listened to them with the expression of a man who finds the people he loves enormously entertaining and is not embarrassed about it. James talked in full sentences by the time he was 2.5, which Dexter attributed to the fact that he had 3 other people providing running commentary on the world from the moment he could hear, and which Florence said was simply that he had decided early on that there was too much to say and not enough time. She found herself pregnant again in the autumn of 1886, which was not entirely unexpected given the state of affairs, and she received the news this time with the ease of familiarity, the settled certainty of a woman who is exactly where she is supposed to be and is not afraid of what is coming next. Another brother, Eli said confidently, when informed. Another sister, me said, equally confidently from long habit. We shall see, Florence said. It was a girl. They named her Clara after Florence's friend in Gallatin, who wept when she received the letter and wrote back 6 pages of joy. Clara Hadley arrived in the spring of 1887 with her mother's light coloring and her father's brown eyes, and a personality that announced itself immediately as distinct from everyone else's and entirely her own. She was the loudest of the 4 children and the most obstinate about naps and the most delighted by everything in the world, and she followed me everywhere from the moment she could walk, and me received this with the magnanimity of a person who has been waiting for exactly this company. The farm grew and improved over the years, as farms do when they are loved. Florence's garden spread from its original corners until the house was framed by green in summer, and the south wall was a wall of red roses from May to October. The kitchen had been enlarged in 1886, a project Dexter undertook with Cotton's help, and which involved approximately 3 weeks of chaos that Florence managed with the patient practicality of a woman who had managed considerably worse. The result was a kitchen that could accommodate the full run of the harvest season's cooking, which was a practical matter, and also, in the way of things that are practical and also right, something beautiful. The letters from Clara in Missouri were regular and full of news. Harmon Vass had been convicted in 1885 and fined and stripped of several land holdings, including properties obtained through the fraudulent water rights ruling. The farmers who had lost their land had not gotten it all back, because the law moves in its own insufficient increments, but they had gotten compensation and acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement mattered. Florence read each update with the kind of measured satisfaction that is different from triumph, cleaner and more permanent, the satisfaction of someone who told the truth when it was dangerous, and was vindicated not because truth always wins, but because sometimes it does. She went back to Gallatin once, in 1888, to visit Clara and to close the remaining practical matters of her life there. She went alone on the train, a journey of 2 days, and she walked through the town where she had once been afraid and felt nothing but the ordinary mild nostalgia of someone revisiting a place that is no longer relevant to who they are. She had a lovely 3 days with Clara, and came home to Dexter at the Ellsworth station on a Tuesday afternoon in October with the light just going golden and the air full of harvest. He was standing at the platform when the train came in. He was wearing his good hat and his good jacket, and he was holding a bunch of the late autumn wildflowers she had never asked for, and that were no less meaningful for not being requested. And when she stepped off the train and saw him standing there, she had to stop for a moment, because the sight of him, the simple and particular fact of Dexter Hadley standing in the autumn light waiting for her, was something she was not sure she was ever going to be fully accustomed to, and she was glad of that. Was glad that it still arrived with force, that it had not become invisible through familiarity. She walked to him, and he gave her the flowers, and they walked to the wagon with her hand through his arm, and the town of Ellsworth moving around them in the ordinary business of a Tuesday afternoon, and she was home before dark. The children came tumbling out of the farmhouse when the wagon came up the drive, all 4 of them, Eli first and then me and then James at a run, and then Clara, who was not quite 2 yet and had been learning to run with the dedicated intensity she brought to every new acquisition, and who managed approximately 4 steps before sitting down hard in the yard dirt and looking at the indignity of this with an expression of profound personal affront. Me scooped her up without breaking stride, and Clara was immediately restored to dignity, and both of them arrived at the wagon at the same time as everyone else. Florence got down and gathered as many of them as could be gathered at once, which was all 4 if she organized it correctly, and she held them in the October yard with the house behind them and the fields and the sky and the roses finished for the season on the south wall, and the man who had first handed her coffee in a garden 3 years before now putting the horses away with the practiced ease of someone who has done it 10,000 times. And she thought of all the things she had been afraid of when she arrived here, and how thoroughly she had been wrong about almost all of them. She had been afraid that safety was a thing that could be taken back. She had been afraid that belonging was a performance that would eventually be exposed as fraudulent. She had been afraid that she had used up whatever portion of good fortune a person could reasonably expect, and that asking for more was the kind of greed that gets punished. She had been afraid that the plates on the table would turn out to mean nothing, or would mean something only temporarily, or would come with conditions she could not meet. None of that had been true. The plates had meant exactly what they appeared to mean. You are expected, and there is room, and we have not even waited to be certain you will come before preparing for your arrival, because that is how much we want you here. She put the children down and went inside and started supper, and Dexter came in from the barn and washed at the pump and came in behind her, and stood at the kitchen doorway for a moment in the exact posture with which he had first told her. His children had set out 3 plates, that careful, deliberate stance of a man who had decided before he walked in exactly how he would hold himself, and was then finding that love made the planning irrelevant, that you could not prepare for it adequately. that it arrived in full every time, no matter how many times it had arrived before. "Welcome home," he said. She turned from the stove. "I was not gone long enough to require a welcome home." "3 days is long enough," he said. She smiled at him in the kitchen light, with supper on the stove and 4 children somewhere in the house in various states of chaos, and the October dark coming down outside and the farm breathing around them in its old patient way. She smiled at him, and he came across the kitchen to her, and she put her hands against his chest and his arms came around her, and for a moment they were just standing there, the two of them, warm and certain and arrived. There was nothing hidden anymore. No dark past pressing at her heels, no forbidden motive in the corner of the room, no trap set by anyone with power over her. There was no more forced choice between safety and love, no more carrying secrets alone through a dark passage toward a distant light. There was just this kitchen and this man and these 4 children and this farm and this life that she had run into when she was running away from something else, and that had turned out to be more than she had dared to want. She had come here to board through harvest and paid her way in labor and earned her keep and kept her word. She had come here from a place of fear and ended in a place of love. She had arrived at a table already set for her by 2 children who had decided before she walked through the door that she was worth preparing for, that she was worth the wildflowers in the jar and the scrubbed wood and the careful arrangement of cups and plates and silverware that said, simply and completely, "You belong here." She did. She did belong here. Florence Hadley, née Crawford, belonged in this farmhouse on this land in this Kansas county in this family with this man, and these 4 children and the south wall roses and the morning coffee in the garden, and the long lamplit evenings of reading and talking, and the particular quality of Ellsworth County sky in autumn, which was, as she had finally concluded after several years of looking at it, the best sky anywhere. She belonged here, and she would belong here for the rest of her life, and it was exactly, precisely, entirely enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.